Welcome to the Mars Hill Bible Study. Today's study concerns part 3 of our series on Revelation 14. All right, so now let's go back to Revelation chapter 14, verse 20, and we need to ask a very important question. Why does God use an overflowing winepress to point to Christ's atonement or the salvation of the elect? But before we answer this question, let's go back and read Revelation chapter 14, verse 20. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse's bridle, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Now, in the previous study, we compared Revelation chapter 14 with Isaiah chapter 63, verse 3, where we learned that Christ is the one who tread the winepress alone in order to pay for the sins of the elect. And we also learned that Hebrews chapter 13 verse 11 through 13 also indicates that Christ tread the winepress without the city, because it is without the city where the lambs or the sacrifices were burned to indicate that atonement was being made for sin. So all of that part lines up perfectly with other scriptures in the Bible. So the question here is, why does this winepress overflow? Well, when we go to Joel chapter 2, we find that an overflowing winepress is associated with the latter rain, which produced a great amount of wine and oil, which caused the winepress to overflow. In verse 23 of Joel chapter 2, we read, Be glad then, ye children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he hath given you the former rain moderately, and will cause to come down for you the rain, the former and the latter rain, in the first month. And the floors shall be full of wheat, and the fats, that's the winepress, shall overflow with wine and oil. So the latter rain is the time when that overflowing occurs to indicate that there has been a successful harvest. And in the case of Revelation chapter 14, the successful harvest is identified with the vine, that is Christ, which produced the clusters of grapes, which represent the true believers. Okay, so Joel 2 provides one example of how the vats or the wine presses overflow. Are there any other examples in the Bible? Well, yes, indeed. If we go to the very next chapter of Joel, specifically Joel chapter 3, we'll find also that God speaks about a wine vat that is overflowing. For example, in Joel 3 verse 13 we read, Put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. And that word ripe there is not the same as the other word ripe, which spoke about a withered harvest. This is actually a good ripe. Then it says, Come, get down, for the press is full, and the fats, that's the winepress, overflow, for their wickedness is great. Now we know that when God is speaking about the fact that their wickedness is great, he's reminding us that those for whom he tread the winepress have sin in their lives. He's actually paying for a multitude of sin, in the sense that he's also saving a great multitude of people who will be saved during the latter rain. Now the context of Joel chapter 3 especially verse 1 is dealing with the fact that there are captives who are going to be freed from the captivity that they were sold into in relation to Tyre and Sidon, who represent the church. Let's read verse 1 of Joel 3. Behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations, and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will plead with them for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. So during this time of captivity, the believers were taken captive by the unsaved. And as I mentioned before, it's speaking of the church. And so Tyre and Sidon are going to have to make recompense to God for bringing his people into captivity. And of course, that recompense is the judgment of God. And that's precisely what happened to the church during the Great Tribulation. Okay, so if a full and overflowing winepress has to do with salvation, what about a winepress that is empty and that is not trodden by Christ? Well, we can find an example of this type of winepress in Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 33. There we read, "And joy and gladness is taken away from the plentiful field, and from the land of Moab." Now, Moab represents the church. "And I have caused wine to fail from the winepresses. None shall tread with shouting. Their shouting shall be no shouting." So here, God is even telling us that not only is the winepress empty, it's failed, but there is none to tread the winepress. And that means that Christ has not made atonement for the sins of Moab, or these people who are associated with the church. We find the same type of language in Isaiah chapter 16, verse 10. There we read, "And gladness is taken away, and joy out of the plentiful field. And in the vineyards there shall be no singing, neither shall there be shouting. The treaders shall tread out no wine in their presses." That's the wine presses. "I have made their vintage shouting to cease." So we see here that there is a wine press that's not being trodden by Christ, to indicate that Christ has not making payment for the sins of these unsaved people in the church. And as a result, the wine press is empty because there's no fruit in the harvest. And remember, we learned in Revelation chapter 14 that first harvest produced ripe or withered fruit. Moreover, that fruit was not put into the wine press, and as a result, there's no treader and there's no overflowing. And the reason is because the church did not receive the latter rain. Okay, so with all of these wonderful spiritual principles in mind, we are ready to understand the meaning of the 1600 furlongs. First, we know when we break down the number 1600 that it equates to 4 times 4 times 100. And the number 4 represents the four corners of the earth, or the extremities of the earth. And that is identified with the fact that the gospel is going into the world, as we learned in the earlier part of Revelation chapter 14. We could also break down the number 1600 into 2 to the 6th power, or 6 2s in a row, times 5 times 5. And we know that the number 2 also represents the sending forth of the gospel. That is the latter rain, which produces the 600 furlongs of blood or wine. And in this case, the number 5 can represent grace or judgment, And we know that as the gospel goes forth, it will bring grace, and it also will bring God's judgment. But I believe in this case that the judgment is actually referring to the fact that Christ tread the winepress of God's wrath to pay for the sins of his elect. Now, what about the word furlong itself? Does that have anything to do with the sending forth of the gospel? Indeed, it does. If we go to 1 Corinthians 9, verse 23, we see that a race is identified with preaching the gospel. In verse 23, we read, "And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. Know ye not that they which run in a race," that's the word furlong, "run all, but one receiveth the prize. So run that ye may obtain." Then in verse 23, we find more information about this run in relation to preaching the gospel. There we read, "I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air, but I keep my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached the gospel to others, I myself should be a castaway." So we have learned in our study of the 1600 furlongs that it is not referring to a time when no one in the world is being saved. On the contrary, it is referring to the fact that the latter rain gospel will produce a great harvest of believers who are typified as clusters of grapes who come from the vine Christ. And together they are cast into the winepress of the wrath of God to demonstrate that they are saved completely by the work of Jesus Christ. Well, that concludes part 3 of our study in Revelation chapter 14. Until the next time, may the Lord richly bless you.